Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Hosier, and I am the Director of Programs here at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. The Jackson Center envisions a world where the universal principles of justice, fairness, equality, and the rule of law prevail. Today, we are pleased to continue our year-long virtual symposium, Nuremberg at 80, an international reflection. A few housekeeping notes: if you need the automated captions, they are enabled, so you can turn those on. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of our conversation, but don't feel the need to wait to ask your questions. The Q&A and the chat will be open the entire time. Now, one of the enduring challenges of teaching history is helping people move beyond simply knowing what happened to understanding what it actually felt like to live it. The Nuremberg trial is often remembered for its historic verdicts and lasting legal legacy, but for those who participated in it, whether it be as prosecutors, judges, defense counsel, witnesses, defendants, it was a living process, and it was filled with uncertainty, competing priorities, and profound moral questions. How we help modern audiences grapple with these same questions? How do we move beyond reading documents and studying outcomes to better understand the difficult decisions that shaped the course of international justice? One answer is through simulation. By stepping into historic roles and wrestling with the evidence, the arguments, and the legal principles that emerged during Nuremberg, participants gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of the complexities of pursuing justice after atrocity. Such programs challenge participants not only to learn history, but also engage with the dilemmas, both legal and ethical, that continue to resonate in our world today. Today, we are honored to be partnering with the Churchill Archives Centre at the University of Cambridge. They will share insights from their innovative Nuremberg Trial Simulation that they ran a few months ago, discussing how the program was developed, what participants experienced, and why immersive educational initiatives like this can play an important role in preserving and teaching the lessons of Nuremberg. Joining us are Alan Packwood, Director of Churchill Archives Centre, and Dr. Shang Lang, President of the Cambridge branch of the Historical Association and former Senior Lecturer in History at the Angela Ruskin University. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us as we reflect on the continuing relevance of Nuremberg. Alan, Sean, please take it away.
Yeah, okay. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for that really kind and warm introduction. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. And let me just do that now. Bear with me a second. And I just got some slides to pull up. So my name is Alan Packwood. And as you've just heard, I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre, which is located in the campus of Churchill College. And Churchill College, of course, the British and National Commonwealth Memorial to Sir Winston Churchill, but also one of the 31 constituent colleges of the University of Cambridge. And you're looking at the exterior of the Archive Centre now. If you know anything about the Archive Centre already, and there's no reason why you should do, you probably know two things. The first thing is that, of course, we were purpose-built to house the papers of this man, Sir Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime Prime Minister. And it won't surprise any of you to know that his archive is an enormous collection. Some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items, everything from his childhood letters and school reports through to his final writings. And we even have a couple of unsmoked Churchill cigars in the collection, all the rarer for being unsmoked. Some of you may also know that we have the papers of Margaret Thatcher, including one prime ministerial handbag. But actually, the Archive Centre is much more than this, because in addition to the Churchill papers and the Thatcher archive, we have the papers of some 640 other individuals, politicians, diplomats, military leaders and scientists of the modern era, starting really with Churchill's lifetime, with his contemporaries, and coming right up to date. And that, of course, means that we do have material relating to the Nuremberg trials 80 years ago. We've not so long ago acquired the papers of Sir Hersh Lauterpacht, the lawyer and human rights activist who was instrumental in developing the concept of crimes against humanity, and of course who was attached to the British legal team at Nuremberg. And what you're actually looking at on the screen now is his copy, his draft of the original Nuremberg indictment. We also have the papers of David Maxwell Fyfe, later Lord Kilmuir, who was the assistant British prosecutor at Nuremberg. And his papers include all of his personal letters and correspondence back to his wife. And which give you real insight into what was going on behind the scenes during the trial. So I've just flashed up this one letter. You can see at the top, it's dated the 1st of November, 1945. And perhaps I can draw your attention to the second paragraph here, where Maxwell Fyfe writes about Nuremberg. It is an extremely interesting experience from the point of view of my own psychology. My job is partly conducting a seemingly unending international conference, partly running a small department, partly commanding a military unit, and lastly, getting up a case for trial. Everyone has something wrong. Now, I say, having been involved in organising the international schools event that we're coming on to talk about, I've had a small taste of, I think, of what Maxwell Fyfe was wrestling with. But the Archive Centre houses these papers, and our job is to preserve this material so that it's here not just for this generation, but for generations to come. It's also to make it available and to make it as widely available as possible. So how can we do that? We can do that by having people visit the Archive Centre and look at the material in our reading rooms. We can do it by sending copies to those people who can't make their way to Cambridge. And we can do it by constructing our own research guides and online resources. And we do have on our website an online exhibition relating to Nuremberg, which some of my colleagues put together. But of course, we're always interested in new ways of presenting this material. This goes back to what Elizabeth was saying a moment ago. And so as director of the Archive Centre, I was both intrigued and excited when Sean, who I've known for many years and who has served for many years on our Archives Committee, came to me with a really very interesting proposition. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand over to you, Sean.
Yes, that's Alan's very polite way of saying it's all my fault. And I need first of all to explain sort of who I am and where I come into this, because my background is a combination of university teaching, but particularly school teaching. And I taught, for example, for 10 years in what's called a sixth form college, and that is the level at just below university. So in this country, it's A levels. In Germany, it's Abitur, whichever. I don't know every country's system, but it's the level, before you go off to university. And in my teaching, I quite often like to make use of simulation. Now, simulation in teaching is not quite the same as sort of a computer simulation of an event. You're not necessarily trying to recreate the event. With history, you can't. I mean, for one thing, you've got hindsight. But also, there's a problem about going down the line of, say, role play, because if you sort of put students or anyone actually in a role and say, you are now Robert Jackson, or indeed you are now Goering, you can train them, you can give them as much information as you like, but there's always the possibility and quite a strong temptation for people to go off at a tangent, for whoever's playing Goering to give the wrong answer and then see how you like it. And so in the end, the exercise can begin to lose any sort of educational value and becomes a thing in its own right. So I took some inspiration from something I did when I was school teaching, and don't lose sight of this because I'm going to come back to it much later on, but I will come back to it. And this was an exercise where I managed to get funding, again, to do it internationally with students from various European countries. And we took the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the one at the end of the First World War, and we essentially divided the students up into negotiating teams representing different countries, no one representing their own country. And we gave them the task of getting a good deal out of negotiating with each other to produce a sort of better peace treaty and see how it compared with the Treaty of Versailles. Now, that's not exactly how the Paris Peace Conference worked, but that doesn't matter. The point is, you get them into a framework where they are in a sort of role, and they're dealing with the same sort of issues that the original people in history dealt with. Now, for a trial, there are all sorts of advantages, but some things you have to be careful about. The obvious advantage is that unlike most treaty negotiations, it's got its own inbuilt structure. You have very clear roles: judge, prosecutor, defense, defendant, and so on. You have a structure: the presentation of the case for the prosecution, the presentation of the case for the defense, and cross-examination, and all the rest of it. So that's a huge advantage. You can put people into those sort of roles, and I think particularly in Philadelphia, many of you will be familiar with the idea of mock trials, where you do indeed follow the structure of a trial. The difficulty here with a historical trial is exactly what I was talking about, that it's very easy if people are going to be cross-examining others in role, then you can go off at a tangent. You can very often bring in things which have got nothing really to do with the history. There's also, it has to be said, this sort of rather ethical issue of playing, the head of the SS or the deputy head of the SS, who's the one they had, or whoever. So what I thought, first of all, was that we don't go down the direct role play route. And I looked for inspiration. And I got it in something which those of you who are lawyers, and I gather that some of you are, will be familiar with, but if you're not lawyers, you might not be, which is mooting. Mooting is a lovely old Anglo-Saxon, word going right the way back to pre-Norman times over here, but I've had to explain it a bit. Mooting is a sort of, it's not a mock trial exactly. It's the arguing of legal points in front of a judge. So the lawyers are not cross-examining anyone. They are presenting legal arguments in competition with each other in front of a panel which is qualified to judge. And I thought, now that's actually quite a good way of doing this, that you ask students not to take the direct role of any prosecutor or defense lawyer, and certainly not to take the direct role of any actual defendant, but to take the case, to take a defendant's case, look at the evidence, and there was no shortage of evidence at Nuremberg, as you will know, and use that evidence to present an argued case for the prosecution and the defense to present an argued case for the defense. And then it would be up to a panel of judges to decide. And I thought right from the start that it would be a good idea to have a combination of history and legal expertise on the panel of judges. Would it work? What are we? It was a year and a half ago, wasn't it? It was in November 24. We ran a very small pilot exercise one Saturday morning with 2 local schools in Cambridge. One of whom, in fact, was the sixth form college where I used to teach. And we got the students. We only had 3 cases. I think we had Goering, Dönitz, and Speer. I think from memory, I think that's right. Sorry.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think so. And just to see if it worked. And on the panel of judges, we had Alan and me, and we had a chairing it. We had one of my colleagues from Anglia Ruskin University, who's a law lecturer, but also, or 2 things. One is that she is a judge herself, not in the Crown Court or anything, but she does operate as a judge in particular sort of low-level courts. But also, I had seen her in action with school students on Holocaust Memorial Day activities, where they were sort of presenting arguments a little bit like this. So I knew that she'd be in the right sort of frame of mind, if you like. So we tried it, and we found it worked very, very well. I mean, there are various sort of small details to tweak and change, but the essential activity of presenting an argument from the evidence, facing questions from us. And there's one particular moment I remember, and one thing important, we did say to them, we're in 1945, 46, so you can't bring in major things that came along later. You can't sort of reference the Eichmann trial, for example. And there was one moment I remember when someone did, and then we had to sort of quickly put them right. And there was another moment when we asked for the evidence to support. As I recall, it was in the Goering case. And while the student presenting carried on, one of the team was checking online to come up with the evidence to support what it was that they'd just said. And I thought that worked very well. So the basic structure seemed to work. Then it was a question of going wider. And we did a lot of asking around to try to find, first of all, to get the schools, and then to sort of think about the actual exercise itself, because we'd started with 3 defendants, we could now expand it. And we could also sort of think about the roles of prosecution and defense. And so I had a fine old time. I'm sure there's a computer program that could have done this for me, and no doubt there's one of you who's going to tell me that's what I should have done, but I didn't know. So I did it with my trusty pencil and paper. And I worked out a structure whereby, first of all, there were always more prosecutors than defense speakers. And that was deliberate in order to reflect the imbalance between the 4 national teams prosecuting each defendant and the one German lawyer that each defendant had. And I wanted to get a sense of that across. Secondly, this was very important that this should be international. So not only were we going to get students from different countries, which we did. So we had 2 schools from the States. We had a school from Canada. We had various ones, of course, from the UK. We had 2 local ones to Cambridge, one from further down, sort of in the London area. And in the end, only one was able to come from Wales. And there was more variety in that than might immediately strike you. We had a school from France. We had 2 schools from Germany. And we also had, in fact, a university from Ukraine. It so happened that I'd done some work with the university in Ukraine before the war broke out, and had stayed in touch. What struck me there was that although it's a university, but their younger students weren't that different in age from the sixth formers. So it worked, and in fact, it worked very well. They didn't sort of stand out as university students. So we had those countries represented, and I wanted to make sure that, unlike in the Paris Peace Conference one, where people worked in teams from their school representing whichever country they'd been allocated, this time I wanted them to be mixed together. So for every defendant, the defense lawyers, normally 2, came from different schools, and ideally, as far as possible, different countries. And for every and the prosecution teams again came from, normally 3 came from different schools, and again, as far as possible, from different countries. There were inevitably last-minute changes. We had a school which pulled out at the last minute. We actually had an extra student who was the son of one of our very generous funders who was keen to come. And thanks to the pulling out, we were able to give him more of a role than just coming and observing. We sort of used him. In fact, he appears in the film you'll see in a minute. As one of the defense lawyers. So there inevitably you get last-minute changes. But that basic principle that this was international, that it was based on mooting, of which more in just one second, and with that imbalance, with no one cross-examining, no one playing that sort of role, and with a panel of judges. Now, the judges we had 4, and again, that sort of balance of history and law. So on the history side, well, we had me, but you have to bear with that. We had Dr. Alice Prohaska, who's a very eminent British historian and academic. And we had 2 actual judges, one Canadian, one from Philadelphia. This is where it's a bit different from mooting, because there was a lot more room for intervention by the judges. And this is a little bit more like debating. It was a bit closer to the role that you can have in a debate where you sort of question the presenters. So this exercise was it wasn't quite mooting, and it wasn't quite debating, and it certainly wasn't sort of straightforward reconstruction or role play. It was a bit of it had elements of all of them, which makes it a little bit harder to explain if you haven't seen it, but you'll see it in a second. Um, and I think the best thing to do now, we wanted to have a good film record of this. So we hired a local or relatively local filmmaker whom I have worked with many times before. And he filmed a lot of what went on. He also interviewed people. And what we're making is a film to be about 10, 12 minutes or so, which we can then use to explain what we were doing when, as we hope to do, we go out for funding to take the idea forward. And so what you're going to see now is just a little snip of that film, but it will give you an idea both of the setting of the history behind it. I'm afraid you get to see me again, but also some clips from, or a clip rather, from one of the actual trials, which is actually the trial of Fritz Sauckel.
The students were not just learning about history, they were learning about law, about argument and presentation, and how to think fast on your feet. The issues they were dealing with are, of course, only too relevant today. The cases of Albert Speer, who headed the huge construction work program based on slave labor provided by his deputy, Fritz Sauckel, have long aroused controversy. The suave, highly educated Speer evaded the death penalty. Sauckel, a working-class man of limited education, was hanged. In this exercise too, their cases sparked some drama.
Whatever is written, there is a reality that is different.
We totally understand and acknowledge that these exploitations did happen. But what we are arguing is it is not to the fault of Fritz Sauckel that these exploitations did happen, because he did prove by these documents that he did all in his power to ensure the protections of the workers. That I don't know the exact specifics on the title page of Sauckel 16, but I believe it was Sauckel 16 that I had, but it was a decree that was sent out by Sauckel, and therefore the execution of that, he had already done his part in drafting the legislature, and the execution was not on his part.
Okay, go on. Thank you.
Actually, can I just check on that document you've been quoting or referring to?
Yes.
Says, on the face of it, as you say, therefore the Eastern workers must be treated correctly and justly. And for that reason, everything is to be avoided in the employment of Eastern workers, which might tend to increase the restrictions and hardships. So far, in line with what you've said. But then it says, beyond those brought about by the war. And I'm just wondering, because that sounds to me like a bit of a catch-all. You could always say that some hardship which is imposed is produced by the war. So does that not weaken the force of what you're saying about this document?
Well, I do not believe it does, because given the background of Fritz Sauckel, he was, again, he started as a workers' man. He served in the Marine as a sailor, and in 1933 he was appointed as Gautelier of his region, and as such he did not have the full educational background for drafting legislature, and I believe this is clearly his intent to try to make sure every bit is accounted for, but while also keeping the protections for the workers. Unfortunately, due to his lack of education in this regard, that did not pan out quite as he intended.
So I think you have more that you wanted to argue.
Yes.
Okay, that gives you a pretty good idea of how it worked, and you'll see, you got the judges cutting into questions, checking their reading of the particular documents. We had quite a lot of documents. What I did in advance, or two things really. The first was to produce I said myself, a pretty full pack of materials. This laid out the actual sort of rules for the exercise. itself, but it also gave things that would guide them. So gave quick sort of character sketches of the major defendants or of the defendants they were using, but also a lot, and I mean a lot, of extracts from documents from the Nuremberg trial, the online transcript of the trial, and also highlighting documents that were in the Churchill archives. So they had a lot of material in advance. One thing we would do differently next time was that we did allow them, if they wanted to bring other materials, and we were we were expecting that maybe 2 or 3 people might bring an occasional document or a photograph. No, they all brought a lot of stuff which they need, and which then had to be copied, and so we would do that differently. Next time we would make sure that was submitted a good 6 weeks or so in advance. But the idea was that they were arguing from evidence, and as you heard, they were quizzed on it. We weren't going to let them simply say, as it says in document 3, because we'd want to look at document 3 and does it actually say what you say it said. And working together, quite a few of them had got together, via Zoom and Teams and what have you, to do some planning beforehand. Not all of them, to my surprise, but most of them had. And when we got there, they arrived on the Tuesday evening, and everything was going to be wrapped up by the Thursday. And the point about the Thursday is that they had to deliver a closing statement, and each side had half an hour to present the closing statement for the whole of the prosecution with 8 defendants and the whole of the defence. But how they used that half hour, how they did it, was entirely up to them. They could, if they wanted, simply go through defendant by defendant, which is more or less what the prosecution did. Or they could do what the defence did. And actually, it was rather better to go through charge by charge and not worry too much about the specific details of each defendant. And we listened. And again, there are some things that we learned. So we hadn't really given ourselves enough time for the judges to deliberate, so we did feel a little bit rushed on that one, and that's something we would do differently. But essentially, we, as the judges, we looked at the strength of the cases that had been put to us. Broadly speaking, I have to say, I thought the defence was often stronger than the prosecution case. That's a generalisation, but it was. So let's just say the defence were very, very good. But of course, very often they were simply up against the facts of the case that the prosecution had one way or another brought out. So all in all, we were probably a bit harsher in judgment than the original judges. In fact, I think that is right. For example, we found Speer guilty on all charges. But the main point was, giving the judgments was important, and it certainly gave a sort of closure, if you like, to the exercise. But it wasn't the most educationally important part. The educationally important part was thinking about how do you actually prove these cases and not simply say, hey, they're guilty, they're Nazis. There was a point raised actually before. The other thing I did beforehand was go around and visit as many schools as I could, and if I couldn't visit, then I met the students and teachers on Zoom. And I went to France and spoke with the French students, and one of them actually said, "But how on earth can you defend a Nazi?" And that was an attitude which I think quite a few of them had to start with. But of course, it's a very important question, but a very important answer, because you have to accept that no matter what anyone is accused of, they're entitled not only to a defence, but to the very best defence possible. Otherwise, it's a show trial. Otherwise, you're as bad as the people you're prosecuting. And that meant that it was down to the students. For example, if they're prosecuting, they can't simply say, oh, look what he did, he must be guilty, because they had to think, what's the defence going to come up with? How are we going to counter that? And similarly, the defence couldn't just sort of give it up, and they had to find some way. It might not be getting the defendant off, but it might be mitigating the sentence, as happened, for example, with Dönitz, when the judges did not find him guilty of war crimes in relation to the U-boat war, but did in relation to the use of slave labour in the construction of some of the U-boat bases. So that basic understanding that this is a matter of law, not simply of sweeping historical judgment, was central to it. Alan.
Well, Sean, I was just thinking what you just said, and I think clearly you've highlighted some of the limits on the prosecution team, but it might also just be worth saying something about the limits on the defenders and the fact that again there were certain defences that they were not allowed to use in this exercise.
Yes, that's right. Again, mirroring Nuremberg. So they weren't allowed to use the defense of superior orders, certainly not as a way of getting them off. I mean, we might, as judges, we might take it into account in mitigating a sentence, but it wasn't allowed as an absolute defense. They weren't allowed to challenge the legitimacy of the court, and they weren't allowed to use the tu quoque argument, that you did it just as bad, you were just as bad as us. I hope at some point that we can do something similar based on the Tokyo trial, where that is absolutely an issue, but that's for another day. So all in all, we were very, very pleased with how it went. We had some other activities in there as well. So, for example, the first evening, in fact, we had, I gave a lecture about the trial, but we also had some of the original trial reenacted, because one of the other things I do is theatre, and I had some of the people I work with who reenacted some of the exchanges, including the very moving women who spoke as witnesses from Auschwitz. On the first evening. And then on the second evening, we had an absolutely fascinating panel discussion about the use of film at Nuremberg, where we had Sir John Tusser, who with his wife, or rather his wife, wrote the book with him, which is still, you no doubt know, the Nuremberg trial book. And we also had Sally Angel, who has made a film based on the original British Army film of Belsen and the other concentration camps, made by Sidney Bernstein, and we had Sidney Bernstein's son David. So we were able to. So that was, obviously it wasn't part of the simulation of the trial, but it added to the whole atmosphere, if you like, of it. What we're hoping to do next is that it's too good a thing just to leave as a one-off. That we did, and I think also bearing in the earlier one that I mentioned, the one about the Paris Peace Conference, we've got two exercises, both of them international, both of them simulation exercises, both very powerful, but of a different sort, one a trial and one a peace conference. And this has set me thinking about how we could take this forward. I think there's more mileage in Nuremberg, but I wasn't thinking in terms of doing Nuremberg forever. But I think that you could take a sort of repertoire, I suppose, of international trials like Nuremberg or Tokyo, and perhaps one or two international conferences. Paris again is one, Yalta and or Potsdam, or possibly the two together, would be another, and use those as ways of bringing students from different countries together, from different sort of cultures and political backgrounds together, to use this sort of simulation exercise as a way of exploring the history, but also very clearly addressing some issues which are still current today. And the big advantage of using history is that it gives a certain distance. I mean, I wouldn't dream today of running some sort of exercise based on the war in Ukraine, or the war in Iran, or the war in Gaza, because it's too close, and there are passions, and you'd never really get anywhere. So history gives a certain sort of distance, but it is very obvious that the issues of war crimes or crimes against humanity or aggressive war or the role of international law, all of these things are still current. And that, I think, was clear to the students as well. All I can say is that the feedback we had from students and from teachers was, I was rather humbled by it, to be honest, because, people are always nice and pleasant and polite and what have you after something like that, and after all, they were very aware that they'd had it for free because we had very, very generous funding, but it went way beyond that, and they were talking about people's lives being changed, and one of the richest experiences they'd ever had in their careers. It was that sort of language, and so our hope is that we will be able to find a way to take this forward, a little bit like, if you're familiar with this, Model United Nations exercises, where, again, you've got a structure, And you can have a big one where you lots of people come together, or you can have much smaller ones. And so my vision is that we can sort of use historical examples like this on a similar sort of model, and take things forward as a way of bringing students from different countries together, exchanging ideas, encountering each other, and that can be quite an eye opener. And that was another thing the students said. Finding that people come to these issues from very different assumptions, very different starting points, and I hope building something very positive out of it. So that's what we've been doing.
Sean, thank you very much. I mean, I think that gives everyone a sort of a wonderful sense of what was achieved over the course of just 3 days. I mean, from my perspective, and I didn't really know what to expect. I thought this was incredible in achieving its three real objectives, which were to get the students engaging with historical evidence, using historical evidence, thinking about historical evidence, the challenges of using it. Also, as you've heard, getting them to work with peers from other schools and other nationalities, and also getting them to think about international law and its contemporary application, and bringing all of those three things together, I think was an incredible achievement. And that's really your achievement, Sean. It was a superb exercise in what I would call dynamic learning, I think. And, you know, and myself and many of the observers who were there, I think, also learnt an incredible amount. So, you know, we're hugely grateful to you. I think we are in a phase now where we're reviewing what was done. We're looking at the lessons that we can learn from this. I mean, Sean has mentioned the problem that we had by allowing evidence to be submitted at the last moment. That was a terrible mistake. I was acting as clerk of the court, and effectively what this meant was that with 5 minutes to go before we went live with the next trial session, I was at a photocopier trying to copy sort of 100 sheets of evidence that had been submitted by the students at the last minute. But that does illustrate, I think, their level of engagement with this exercise. The fact that they all went outside of the main research pack and did their own research on the internet. They were doing their own reading, and they were identifying, finding additional materials and submitting them. Now, next time round, we know that we'll impose a firm deadline, and that all evidence will have to be submitted 2 or 3 weeks in advance of the court being convened. I think the other thing that made this, for me, a really effective exercise was the formality that we imposed for the court sessions themselves. So we had real judges, and they came with a certain amount of gravitas. We got them wearing gowns. We got everyone to stand as the judges came into the court at the beginning of each session. And I think what that did was to inject an element of focus into those sessions. We are, I think, very keen to sort of work out how to do this, but also how to do it again, but also how to expand it, how to take it out to a wider audience. Because I think one of the other issues with this, of course, is it was an absolutely wonderful experience for the 11 schools who were able to attend, but that's sort of free participating students, perhaps with a number of supporters from each school. It's not an enormous number. And I think one of the things we want to think about is, well, how do you take elements of this and roll that out to a wider audience? And it would be very interesting to get people's feedback and comments on that. Certainly, we have the genesis of a really good international network, and it's been fantastic to be able to work with the Robert Jackson Centre, with the various schools and colleges, and with others on this. So we feel we're very well positioned to go forward, but I think we need to give some thought about how we grow this going forward. It is also, of course, not cheap to do. And as I alluded earlier, is also logistically incredibly complex, bringing together all of these students from different schools, from different backgrounds, from different time zones, and bringing them together in the one exercise, but an incredibly rewarding experience. Sean, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I've just seen a question from Kristen
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
were there any schools reticent to act as defence counsel, and how was that handled? Yeah, it's a very good question, because you're quite right, there were. Um, right at the start, there was a school in Washington, DC, wasn't it?
Yes, there was. Yeah. Um,
Um,
so, I mean, this is a school that I had contact. Well, I knew one of the teachers there. He's a former master's student of mine. And knowing that he was now teaching in Washington, D.C., knowing that we were looking for American schools for this exercise, I reached out to him to see if he would be interested in bringing a school group over. He was certainly very interested and very positive. But his when he took this sort of up the chain within his school, there was very real anxiety expressed that their students should not be seen to be defending Nazis. But this goes back to a point that you addressed in your remarks earlier, Sean, actually about how important that is in terms of sort of demonstrating the difference between the democracies and the Nazis and the importance of international law.
I I think sometimes it wasn't something that I encountered when I went around schools. I had a couple of days, for example, with the German schools, where you might have thought it would be very sensitive, and absolutely not. You know, they were right up for it. But it's one of those issues, not necessarily for the teachers or for the students, but it's more, as Alan was saying, with the school in Washington, either the people higher up within the school, so directors, principals, and so on, or an eye to the local media. I think that's something where people can be a bit worried in case a local journalist, perhaps, dare I say, an unscrupulous journalist, as if such things exist. I've heard tell of these things, who might sort of think, hey, there's a story here. And particularly in the current climate, it could be a very inflammatory one. So, yeah, it's an issue. It wasn't one which came up with anyone else, but it's something that we were conscious of. But on the other hand, we have the answer, just as I gave to the same answer to the student in France, and maybe she was won over. So yeah, it's an important one, but very important not to use it as a reason not to do the exercise, if you see what I mean.
We actually have a similar question in the chat from Mark Passawark. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who asks, referring back to your earlier remarks, what is the impediment to having participants play Goering or Hitler? Actors are often asked to play undesirable characters. I mean, I'm sure, Sean, you'll have a full answer for this. I mean, one thing I would say is I think actually having people acting as the defendants would have acted in many ways as a huge distraction from the exercise in the room. The focus would have shifted from the evidence and the debate about the evidence to a focus on the acting and the playing of these personalities. And I think there's a danger that would sort of lead you away from the focus on the historical and legal arguments.
Yeah. I mean, the answer to the point is, in terms of dramatic reconstruction, no problem at all. And in fact, when we did the dramatic reconstruction on the first evening, we had someone playing Goering, who in fact played him in the pilot exercise that we did back in November 24 as well. But the emphasis here was on argument rather than cross-examination, because there's nothing wrong with doing actors, with people playing the role and cross-examining, but it's a different sort of exercise. That's a mock trial, whereas this is more about sort of legal argument. So in that sense, it would, in itself, even if it was well done, it's not quite what we were about. But also, I know from experience of doing it, where you have got people playing roles, that with the best will in the world, if something comes up which they don't know about, and they go off they make a guess or something of what the answer is, or whatever, and before you know it, you've actually departed. And then what do? Do you step in and put them right? In which case you either break the spell, or do you let it run? It's much easier just to keep it to in this particular exercise, keeping it to the arguments. But I wouldn't be against the idea of, in a different type of exercise, doing a mock trial, but it is a different type of exercise.
So we've got two questions that have come in that sort of relate now, in a sense, more to the history of Nuremberg than to our exercise. Although, so we've got a question from Sophie. Do you think the Nazis could have won the trial somehow? And if so, with what arguments? And I suppose we could look at that as, could they have won it at the time? Actually looking then at what happens in our exercise, where you've already said that actually many of the defence arguments were very strong and very powerful. How close did they come to winning it in that exercise? And then we've got a very specific question from Mark about did we deal with the problems raised by the prosecution not indicting Dönitz for the machine gunning of sailors who survived their ship being sunk?
If I take the Dönitz one first, we left it entirely up to the students which aspects of the case they wanted to highlight. In the case of Dönitz, there was a lot of argument about the Laconia order, and the Nimitz affidavit as well. But that specific issue about machine gunning sailors, as I recall, it wasn't aired in court specifically. It was more about leaving survivors to drown. It was that sort of thing, but not the specific machine gunning. But which aspects, which documents they used, or which particular examples they used, was entirely up to them. We did not dictate it. So, if they'd wanted to, they'd have been entirely free to do so. What was the first one?
So the other question was from Sophie, and it's about whether the Nazis could actually have mounted an effective defence at Nuremberg, and actually.
The answer to that, Sophie, is yes, they could, and the judges would have acquitted. I think what it realistically would have needed to happen would have been a totally incompetent prosecution team, and there were no incompetents, among the students. But had they gone in a little, let's say, and this is not beyond the realms of imagination, had they gone in a little bit cocky, maybe a little bit lazy, and just saying that look at what this guy did, and that would be enough, and the defence had then come back and as they did, and argued about where exactly in the hierarchy they came, not exactly obeying orders, but being decisions taken above my pay grade, that sort of line of argument. Now that was used. For example, they tried it pretty fiercely in the case of Keitel, and they were trying, and it didn't really work, because what they were saying was that this man in charge of the German High Command was essentially a sort of messenger boy, and I don't think anyone was quite buying that. But that,
and Sean, just to clarify, you're talking now about the evidence that the students produced in the exercise rather than the original Nuremberg trial. We should just make that clear.
So the students were essentially trying to suggest that all he did was sign things, and that didn't really wash. But that argument that to say that, for example, this is the one with Sauckel, to say, well, look, these decisions were taken higher up. It's not just that I was obeying orders, but that I wasn't taking decisions. That was an argument that they did use and could use, and that was worth listening to. We needed to be convinced it was true, but which in the case of Keitel we weren't. But nevertheless, it was a valid argument, and again, of course, reflects the sort of thing that was used. But I think that would need to be balanced, assuming, of course, you haven't got a case of an actual alibi or whatever, which in some cases you might. But it would have to be something like that, coupled with a comprehensive failure of the prosecution to get their act together. And then I think you are looking at potential acquittals. And had that happened, the judges would have been prepared to do so. In reality, what was more likely was a perfectly competent, sometimes very good presentation by the prosecution, a perfectly competent presentation, sometimes again, very good by the defense, and maybe a mitigation. So maybe find guilty on, one of the charges, but not on one of the others, something like that. And although we didn't go down the line of what do you call it, sentences, we didn't sentence anyone. But had we done so, we could, and we did actually indicate that in some cases that would have mitigated the sentence. So I think that's probably how it would be more likely to go.
And in all of that, Sean, is it fair to say that that's everything that you've just said about our trial is actually equally applicable in a way to the original Nuremberg trial itself?
Absolutely, yes. And someone's made the point that, of course, 3 defendants were acquitted. We had one of them. That's right, isn't it? Yes, we had one of them on trial in R1, which is Halmar Schacht. He was found guilty this time, but it was touch and go with him. I think had we had one of or both of the other two, then I think there's a strong chance that it would have followed the original and we could have acquitted. Because I mean, if Fritzsche, for example, there really isn't much of a case, is there? But no, we were not going to be bound by the original verdicts. The idea was to be bound only by what we heard. Now, I think in candor that we needed a bit more time. So we need to do a bit of thinking. But that was the principle of the whole exercise. If defence proved their case, or rather, you know what I mean, not prove the case, but if the prosecution failed to prove their case and the defence showed it, then we were quite prepared to acquit, and we did indeed acquit on some of the individual charges.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time. We've got sort of just under 10 minutes to go now. But we've moved. We've got the perfect question in the chat now to move from the past, the present towards the future. And so the question there is, what can we learn from these trials with future and/or current international human civil rights law violations on the steps of how to build a case and bring individuals and/or governments accountable? What made it possible then, and how can we apply those steps today? Well, of course, that's a huge question, and I think we're hoping that our small simulation, it can be one step along that route, and a starting point for some of this, and certainly a starting point for some of this discussion, if we can find the right way to grow it, really.
Yeah, it's worth saying that the Ukrainians, I didn't have this conversation. It was one of the other judges, and it was just sort of chatting with them, and Kevin told me that from their point of view, this was a learning exercise about how you prosecute war crimes. And I think we can see exactly what's going on in their minds. And so there's a direct application to today, or indeed to tomorrow. But more generally, I think what did come across very, very clearly was the importance, but also the difficulty of applying international law. And I think if there's one thing, there were many things that they came away with, but one that they came away with was an awareness that it wasn't as easy as they thought. And I think in terms of, what can we do and how can we apply it? I think as in an educative role, all you can do is give young people as fair and as frank an introduction to these issues as possible, because in the end, they're the ones who'll have to run with it. I think if we'd done some sort of exercise which suggested in any way that it was a bit of a foregone conclusion or it was easy, which incidentally, a simple reconstruction of the trial could have done, because you're simply watching what happened in the past, then I think you give very much the wrong message. But if they come away thinking that if you want to apply international law, you've got to do your homework, you've got to do it, fairly, you've got to have actual hold of the people and so on, all of these practical logistical issues and the argument issues, then I think you've achieved something which can be applied, and they will apply in the future. But that, of course, is the role of education. It's to it's not just planting a seed, but it is, I've got to mix my metaphors here. Can you plant a seed and then send something in the right direction? I suppose for gardening, in a sense, you can. But it's that sort of mixture of the two, and that I think is what we're about.
Well, the right direction for a seed is upwards, and I think we're always trying to move towards the light. So at this point, I think what I would like to do is bring back Elizabeth from the Robert Jackson Centre, if you're still there, Elizabeth, because I mean, obviously, we've moved on to discussing things which are in some ways your bread and butter in terms of how you educate people about these issues. And it would be, I think, really helpful for Sean and myself just to get a sense of sort of your reaction to what we've described, and you know, obviously we're very grateful for the support that you gave this exercise. But where would you see this sort of simulation developing?
Yeah, I think in a sense of how you put it, with the for us too, it's also about international cooperation. I think we have this sense of how divided things are, not only in America, but in the world, and how everybody wants to disagree. But how do we disagree in a productive manner? And, you know, just the overarching, not only learning about international law and learning about the legacy of Nuremberg, but also learning that international cooperation, which was incredibly hard to accomplish. I mean, we think about after World War I, we tried the League of Nations, it didn't work. So how were they able, after World War II, to come together and make this trial happen and then make the UN happen? Something shifted, something changed. And are we still that cooperative with each other? And how do we maintain that cooperation? When we were approached to help find a US team for your simulation, we were very excited about the prospect of what you were doing and very interested in it. And as it continues to grow and move forward, we even look to maybe have like an American qualifier to pick what teams come to the competition in the UK, because it's so important. It should have that prestige of like, you have to qualify to get to go.
That's fantastic. Well, I mean, I think in a way that's the perfect note for us to end on. What I should do is obviously thank the Robert Jackson Centre for both your support of this exercise, but also allowing us this opportunity to come back and think about it and reflect on it. Sean and I are still sort of developing this concept. So for all of the people out there who are listening to this, if it's sparked thoughts and ideas and comments on other things that we might do, other approaches that we might take, refinements that we might make, you know, please do send them to the Robert Jackson Centre, and I'm sure that Elizabeth would be able to pass them on to us. But, you know, thank you all for taking the time out of your breakfast or lunch or tea, wherever you are in the world, to listen and contribute to this. Thank you all very much for your questions.
Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your evening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye, everyone.